So let's imagine 3, 4 years ago, 2021, 2022, many individuals went into buying pre-sales. And, in Vancouver history, we were always accustomed to a certain pattern. And here we are in 2026, the pattern is different. And as these projects are coming to completion, one of the hottest topics is, can I walk away from pre-sales? And today's guest, I'm thankful to have an expert on this matter, is Justin. Justin Levine, just going to give him a little bit of a pre-introduction in here. A partner and lawyer at Golby Levine Lawyers and Advisors here in the Tri-Cities market. So it's actually, we're very close. And Justin focuses on real estate and business law, helping families, individuals, businesses with complex legal needs. And today he is joining me on this podcast to be able to share his legal insight on what happens if an individual walks away from a pre-sale. Kind of broken this, our conversation is really 5 segments. And this first segment is going to be talking about mostly as a legal aspect of the pre-sale. Then we talk about the market changes. Then the core subject of can people walk away from pre-sale, the consequences. And I think I can also ask if you have any real case scenarios for us to share, so we can actually see what real examples looks like. So Justin, now the starting off is, before we get into the legal side of walking away from pre-sale deals, explain to us what a pre-sale contract actually is from a legal perspective. And when somebody signs a pre-sale agreement with a developer, what obligation are they committing to?
When we say pre-sale contract, we all know what you mean. We get it. And it may or may not be a defined term. It's an interesting name, pre-sale. Well, it's a contract. Something's been sold. So it's really pre-built contract, but sometimes they are built. So we lack good ways to describe these. But they're not like other pieces of real estate to buy. Taking a 1,000-mile view, what's the legal landscape that's governing this? I know we'll do the drier law later, but it's generally when you buy and sell a piece of residential real estate agents have evolved their own standard form contract, which is a pretty darn good one. It's pretty balanced in terms of contracts go. When you're buying a pre-sale, often the developer creates their own contract. And by often, I mean I've never not seen that. When there's multi-units, maybe a mom and pop style developer doing a small thing, but that alone, poses an interesting point. The first is if you're calling a lawyer or an agent to say, hey, it's a resale of a pre-existing property on that standard form contract, most lawyers worth their weight essentially have that agreement memorized. We know the variables, we know the legal concerns that bring that up. On a pre-build, it's very expensive for me to review these 15 to 50 page plus contracts, plus the disclosure documents we'll get in a second. So just getting up to speed on what does the contract say. You're gonna have to spend a couple $100 an hour in legal fees with no clear return on that, just for me to understand what to do. Then I can give you the advice. That alone, practically speaking, is the reason most people don't get legal advice. Because they call a lawyer and the lawyer says, yeah, it's gonna cost $1,000 for me to read the contract, understand it, then I'll talk to you about what's going on. That's so unattractive. And that's not anybody's fault. That's just the nature of the game. And I'll say a lot of things during this podcast. I'm not calling developers bad or evil by any stretch of the imagination. I can do a whole second podcast on their perspective. But ultimately, you're buying the right to purchase. You're forced to purchase a future piece of property. There's some variables we don't know. What are the big obligations when you're buying? You got to put money down, that deposit. Probably deposits to come in the future on a timeline, and then pay the balance when ready. And when ready, that's the big delay. We don't know when this will close. And that's the cause of the delay. Is so much, you sign the contract, we're excited, reality hits at some point. Maybe that reality isn't as we expected it. In law, I use the expression gazing into the crystal ball that is the future. You have to do that. You're signing a contract to give maybe $1 million+ bucks without knowing the interest rates, without knowing the closing date, right. Not even knowing the strata payments, property tax amount. There's so many unvariables, but you're binding a legally binding contract. That deposit you pay it's held in trust somewhere as you pay more and more deposits. Developer, kind of that's that intersection, kind of that's just regular contract law. Because it's a pre-built contract, there's a piece of legislation unique to British Columbia called REDMA. It's kind of an acronym, initialism for the Real Estate
Familiar,
Development Act. That's going to talk about disclosure. We'll get to later. That's the big angle people try to use to get out of these deals, is because of all these variables that I'm rambling about, the developers got to disclose to you what's going on, almost like a public security disclosure documents in a stock market. Not similar, but similar in concept, that here's what we know, here's some risks, and they disclose everything to you. And if they don't disclose something to you, we'll talk about that later, but that's a big to-do is finding out that disclosure aspect. But effectively, that's what makes pre-sales different, is you know what you're buying without really knowing what you're buying. And you don't really know when you're buying it, but you have a rough idea. And the disclosure has this positive obligation to keep disclosing material facts to you.
So to recapping this, pre-sale is a promise to purchase something that has not yet been built. And then here are the deposits, but every contract is different from each developer and every projects.
Yeah, nailed it. Now the principles are the same. There's going to be, like, if you look at I won't go into it now, but if we look at the anatomy of a contract, the elements of a contract are still, they're just, those developer has a lawyer in their pockets and they task them to draft a contract that's probably going to be much more seller or vendor or developer favored than the standard form. Full disclosure, I bought a pre-build. I bought a commercial unit pre-build. But on the other hand, conservative, risk adverse, that's what you get out of a lawyer often, is risk adverse conservative advice, is don't buy pre-sales. It's too risky. I say that all the time, but I will often kind of add a disclaimer to say that's the risk adverse advice. I've done it myself. And was I burned? Yeah. You know what? The strata was higher than I was expecting. The delay was longer than I wanted. Interest rates were higher than I wanted. It went exactly as I expected, to be fair, but I expected it not to go well. My expectations were well managed, I guess. And it's a shame that a lot of other people don't. I'm practicing law for over 10 years, and so that's not who the market of pre-sales should be. And I think the government's recognizing this with rescission rules, and they're trying to. And we're coming out of a wild time in real estate, which I think does have kind of factual relevancy here too. There was this fear of missing out that I think people offered and got themselves into a situation, and there's no amount of lawyering to get out of that. Like, to get out of making a bad decision. I won't ramble, but very short, I say to all clients in all situations, there's only 4 ways to manage risk. Getting out of pre-sale contracts, that is risk. Risk is just uncertainty to me.
Yes.
4 things: do a good job, have a contract, be incorporated, carry insurance. Everything in law and risk reduction falls into those. So do a good job is more about negligence, doing due diligence. Sometimes we can't. And my point on FOMO was that the real estate market created an opportunity where that wasn't a reasonable way to get the property you wanted. Slow, let's be, dutiful. And so that one isn't really a good one in this context. Be incorporated. You're not going to buy your home through a corporation. It's just a weird way to do it for various tax reasons. Carry insurance. Yeah. Insurance, there's no insurance I'm aware of for this particular not being able to buy it. And the contract was probably not going to help you. So, when you look at those heads of damages, we're really looking at the contract as like the main source.
So let's pick some of our major developers in Lower Mainland. We have the major ones as Ani, Polygon, Boza, and then you have other developers. So if you were to explain their contract structure, what's kind of a focus does developer take when people are signing the contracts? Like, it's not our standard contract of purchase and sale, but can you elaborate on like these contracts which you have reviewed about the developers?
Yeah, this is going to make it sound anti-developer, but again, not my intention. Sorry, clients who are developers. But they're going to have representations and warranties on certain things, right? We, speaking as a developer kind of concept, right? I, as a developer, I exist as a corporation. The land is, so it seems. This is kind of the backbone representations and warranties that form all contracts. But the meat and potatoes of these contracts are going to be ways to protect the developer. For example, color scheme. There's going to be something where you pick the color scheme. There's going to be often maybe on the front couple pages, right? The formatting is advocacy as well. In these contracts, I put the variables up on the front page, easier for the team to manage administratively, and then we'll bury all the heavy legal content in, the fine print kind of concept. Yeah. But, color scheme, they can vary. Even though you picked something, they can vary. How much can they vary? Contractually, you can modify these things. If you've pre-agreed to a level of change on square footage, sometimes what percentage of square footage up or down from what you signed is permitted. Well, sometimes the contracts will even say up or minus 10%. Unlikely you're going to give more. Why would that happen? Well, there's probably a legitimate, in my experience, I can't speak for everybody, the reason you include that is when you're selling a building that hasn't yet been built, something might come up.
Of course. Yeah.
Coding, engineering, I don't know. Coding, I mean, like building code where you had to change something. That's why it's so complex. And I don't have to defend the developers, but they're trying to make sure this project's a success and want us. I don't quote me on this, but I don't believe, based on my understanding, there's sometimes a misconception that they accrue the deposit money and spend that deposit money on the development. That deposit money is in trust and set aside. But it is a good way to borrow against, right? To be able to prove that, look, so they kind of need the pre-sale to get the property done, which is part of the weird muddiness here. I'm not saying don't do pre-sales, just saying that those pre-sale contracts are going to be stacked in a way where you're going to be getting roughly that, roughly that color scheme, roughly this size, roughly with this strata makeup. And there are ways to be tricksy with these things. If you've ever taken over a new strata, often the developer has done things that maybe, I'm not alleging bad, but might seem to artificially keep strata fees lower. That way they can legitimately say, and then the council takes a year to realize, wait a second, they didn't do X, Y, and now we have to raise the strata. So there's, even once you see a high strata fee, as a pessimist, assume it's going to be higher.
I've seen those, obviously, as a agent that have assisted clients with the contracts. There's a string of bundles of documents that for an average person, obviously going through every single detail of it is quite extensive.
Extensive and unfair, right? If you think about it, you're some sort of civil servant, double income, you got a young kid, you're a cat, you work full time. You've hired an agent who's busting their backside. The limited time you have, you're looking at, and then here's a 55-page contract, and we're moving quick, and the market conditions make it really unfair for buyers.
Absolutely, and that brings us to today's market, and fast forward because we know today markets uncertainty, trade turbulence with globally, and so demand is very low. And we see it in the assignments market, we see it in the resale market. So say all of these pre-sales, some people that are coming to completion for many lists of reasons, whether the value of this condo has dropped, whether they can't get mortgage, and they say, you know what, we'll just simply walk away. And the perception out there, at least hearing, is to say 10, 15, 20% deposit we have paid down, sure. Let's just walk away. Is that the only thing a buyer will lose, or what else should we all actually learn and know what could be the next consequences specifically from walking away, and is deposit the only thing that people can lose?
There's a couple of different answers I can give you. One is going to be kind of, which I'm going to give you my legal thoughts on it. Okay. The reality is it depends. It's such a fact-driven scenario. When I say fact-driven, what I mean is the specific circumstance, the contract, what happened, what's going on. That's really where it's going to be. But this concept of walking away from your deposit might have made sense on an up-moving market, because thinking about it from the developer's perspective, right? When you think about disputes, nobody cares what you think and how you feel. You got to put your mind the other side. What did they lose? How are they going to react? That's the right way to think through it. On an upswing market, I can't complete my unit. Well, it's gone up in value, theoretically. So a developer can just sell it for more money. And so you walking away from your deposit probably would work in that kind of market, because the developer is not going to voluntarily return it unless you ask for it back. And then we got to look at the contract to see what kind of liquidated damages, which is a concept we can get into later on, kind of a pre-estimate. Instead of me suing you and proving what I lost and making a court agree and pay, we can pre-agree that maybe if we breach this, you'll pay me this flat amount. As just to not play that game. That would be liquidated damages. Sometimes contracts deal with deposits in that way, but unlikely. Back in the upmarket, the advice would just be to tell the developer. Often the antidote was like, maybe not the whole deposit, but maybe acknowledge that we'll pay the developer's interest closing costs from the point we didn't close to the time they sell it for more money. It's a couple grand. That wasn't an uncommon way to deal with a reasonable developer and a reasonable client. Sometimes clients and sometimes developers take unreasonable positions. In this sort of market, walking away from the deposit is kind of or losing the deposit is the clearest defined loss because somebody else has your money. So that might give the developer the right to just keep the deposit. But if the developer sells the unit reasonably for less money, 10% less money, you owe the developer that difference because they could have sold it to you for $1 million, but they ended up only selling it for $900,000. You still owe the developer $100 grand. If that deposit happens to be $100 grand, you'll walk away from your deposit. You're not walking away from anything. It's not your decision, right? Is the developer going to allow you to walk, or will they drag you in front of the courts? And let's go back to that example of selling it for $900 when you bought it for $1 million. You took that loss, and the developer took that loss. You got to make the developer whole. They don't get your 900 or your million and the 900. So an interesting component here is the concept of mitigation. I can't just suffer a loss and wait and have it kind of go up and have it compound my losses and then sue you for it. I have a positive obligation to try to minimize my losses. In other words, contextually, I got to try to sell the unit you didn't buy. So the developer has to do that. So what's a good thing to consider, not legal advice, of course, is this thing saleable? And if there's a secondary market, that's your best bet. Try to find a buyer, or go to the developer and say, no, walking away is always a possibility, but really that's an interesting phrasing, common phrasing. The phrasing ought to be, you're doing a bit of the game of chicken. What's the likelihood the developer's losses will exceed the deposit? Step A. Step B, what's the likelihood the developer will spend money to recover that loss from you? Try to get some, 90 cents on the dollar kind of concept. People, when they say walk away from a deposit, legally speaking, they've made that determination. They don't know consciously, but they've said, I think that's good enough, and that might be, but you're going to want that release. You're going to want to part of the settlement. Hey, developer, you keep the deposit if you promise not to sue me. But even just asking for that is a very dangerous is the wrong word, risky. If you ask somebody, hey, I'd like to breach the contract, the other party has a right to consider that a breached contract, generally. Hey, whoa, contract's over. I've lost faith in your ability to complete. You said I cannot close. You've breached the contract. Oh, no. So we've got to be very careful with how we phrase things. That's often why you want a lawyer, is to make sure that you don't, accidentally make the developer more angry with you. There's some walk away from the deposit. There's some other tricky ways to try to deal with this issue that we can explore if that's something you're interested in. Not necessarily the most ethical, but ways that I've seen in the past people do. The most common is an assignment, is assigning something to a shell company or a third party. It gets really gray. There's all these legal obligations to act in good faith. But I have seen many developers allow assignments into companies, into corporations, and that corporation not have a personal guarantee or any kind of personal thing connected. So you sign it to a company and you walk. I wouldn't necessarily advise anyone do that, but I have seen it done from, I'll be rude, to sloppy developers. Generally, when you assign it, the assignor is also liable. So I can't close, I assign a person A, they can't close. Often the developer can sue either one of us or both of us. Have the courts figure it out. And this assignment thing doesn't work if you're still liable, obviously. It doesn't defeat this is much more common with commercial properties for obvious reasons.
Let's just take an example, because obviously we know the market. A buyer bought a condo for $1 million, put $200,000 as a deposit in increments. Let's just say The developer sells that for 700,000. And so from a million agreed to the reality of what's sold at 700. So can you just clarify what happens to the 200,000 deposit and also the developer's gap of 300,000 difference?
So the developers lost 300 grand on on flipping it after we defaulted, but is still holding 200,000 of our money in their trust account. So if I understand this right, there's still $100,000 lost because my actions or inactions, the situation that I found myself in, resulted in this third party, the developer, losing $300,000. And I was like, oh, don't worry about it. I got 200 in your trust account. That might be a good settlement. Negotiation is the key here. You keep the deposit in exchange for releasing me. Why would a developer agree to that? Why would I, if I was working for a developer, to say, hey, look at this email threat. What would you do, Justin? What should I do? Lawyers can sometimes be jerks. No surprises. My first thought is say, well, why don't you just say, no, I'm going to keep the deposit and sue you? Whether or not you actually sue them is a different story. I probably wouldn't advise to sue somebody. What's the dollar value to sue somebody for? Can't give it to you because it's so subjective. Personally, I own a law firm. I have lawyers and legal resources at my disposal. I'm still not going to sue somebody for 50 grand. And even that
makes sense.
Not even really worth, it's small claims is 35,000. Maybe they could sue you if it's something like, but that's that game of chicken. Will the developer care about the $100,000 loss? Ignoring it won't probably help. It might make sense at that point on kind of a without prejudice settlement conversation, try to explain. If you know you cannot complete, then it at some point might make clean to get to the developer sooner than later. If working for developers I have, most of them are going to be less happy about finding out something didn't close on closing rather than a month before. You have time to negotiate. Yes. They can relist. Keep in mind, we have agents, we have mortgage brokers, we have lawyers, we have appraisers. There's so many other people involved that when big numbers move around, it's not just you versus them anymore. There's a lot of other considerations that need to play into it.
So if we were to look at this scenario, is that $100,000 difference is a question mark based on what the developer could do, their legal representative could do, but it's guaranteed 200,000 is basically going to be kept. So if I were to turn this into another case scenario, Justin, say 200,000 deposit, developer turns around and sells it for 900,000.
What did I buy it for in this example? What was the
$1 million? You bought it at $1 million, put 200,000, 20% deposit, walk away, and the developer sells it for 900,000. So in theory, it's $100,000 loss for the developer. Can a buyer still have any entitlement to 100,000 of their deposit?
Absolutely. I would till I'm blue in the face, take the position that I get the excess deposit. You don't make profit when the counterparty, I'm the developer's lawyer speaking, for example, me and my client, the developer, we're not supposed to make extra money from your ability to close the deal. We need you to just be made whole and no more. That concept can be tricky because the sale price you noted difference, that's the easy one. But if that time period between me signing the contract and the developer not finding a new buyer at a slightly lower price, if that took a year, there's indirect costs. That developer was carrying the unit, maybe they had real estate marketing expenses, they want to get cute. And you can litigate each one and show me the proof and is it reasonable and is it, and we'll have to look at the developer's contract to see how we've modified whether or not they can make those claims. They probably have preserved the right to make those claims. So short answer is yes. If that happened quick, then they're gonna get the deposit back. If I was the developer's lawyer, you'd probably want to give it back. Depending on, this is going more in the political idea, but sometimes the thought process as a lawyer is here's the law, here's the risk adverse thing. The older as I get as a lawyer, the more I realize you got to take a step back and recognize, hey, you got 30% of this building to sell. lawsuits are generally public. Depending on the contract, maybe they go to something.
Right.
But like, hey, is this, you got a lot of deals to close still? So sometimes it's like, hey, let's just ignore them, try to sell them, see what happened, and reassess later. And to be fair, we're in that now. So I can't really tell you what's going to happen on the outside, but that's kind of the idea. Now, if it's the last couple of units or your reputation's already garbage, that may change the legal position they take. But the developers you named earlier, reputable companies, right? They're not trying to ruin their reputation for one project. They're in this for the multi-generational game here, but they're not pushovers. And if they think they're owed hundreds of thousands of dollars, they don't care, and I'll be rude, that somebody made a rash decision and can't close on it. Why should we lose money because somebody was acting in a way that they couldn't afford? That's their thought, and they're not wrong. There is a level of truth there. It's going to be a bit of a bloodbath out there for a while. We'll see what happens. Ultimately, another thing in that political angle, there's an expression at law, litigators use more, that you can't get blood from a stone. If your only money you had, you scrimp together and is in their trust account as a down payment, you may not be a good target to sue. And how do you know that? Not that everyone does this. I can search your name in the land title office. Do you own real estate? Is there a mortgage on it? It's relatively cheap to search. I can see pretty quick. Advise my client, listen, they have no land. So if I have a condo and I'm moving to a different presale, maybe you have an asset, but if you're renting and you're moving in, maybe you have a bunch of cash, but that's not easy to see in a public register. That does come into my mind when I'm advising, are we going to sue this person? I'll give you I'll ruin the surprise. Often the answer is sue them anyways. Those judgments are good for 10 years. We'll see what happens. That's bad advice if your client's like, I'm losing money and I have to pay money to you, lawyer, to say maybe one day we can collect. You get a really expensive piece of paper that $10,000, $20,000 to get this court order, and the guy has no money. I won't have that client for very long. Winning the lawsuit and collecting are very different, and that's not something I would want to really motivate purchasers with. Hey, don't worry, you have nothing else to sue, just go bankrupt. Not the best legal strategy, but it is an option if you're really bad in a position, and bankruptcy is the option. I don't want to call that leverage, but maybe consider talking to a lawyer and communicating that in your strategy. Hey, developer, I can't close. I'm insolvent. How about you keep the deposit? You can sue me other ways, but not going to happen. There's nothing here. I'll just have to go bankrupt, and that's a mess for everybody.
And there's so many cases happens, and tying this options to a buyer and a developer. Let's take an example of this last example we used. You say that 100,000 can be an entitlement to a buyer. They can go back. How long these processes takes, and what is it going to require before somebody even see a resolution?
You're hitting on an interesting strategic point. I'm going to answer the strategic level first. Would be, do you want to stick around to find out? If you're the buyer, you kind of want to just tuck your tail between your legs and run. So strategically, that's like, hey, the more I engage with the developer, the more I know who I am, the more I kind of want to just be invisible. That's a thought I get a lot of the time, rather than kind of indirectly I'm saying, hey, make your problem known to them and negotiate and work with them. So how long does it take? Okay. Well, if the developer's got a team of in-house agents trying to sell this property, that might be different. It's going to be very market force dependent. Can it sell? Depending on how the market's doing. The same principles apply in resale of residential property. And I'll use that as an example. If you had Jane Smith owned a home and she was the seller, and instead of developer in this case, what's her motivation to, bust her chops and try to find a buyer? Could be high, could be low. If you're the defaulting contract party, the purchaser, you could try to find a buyer for them. It gets weird in the development context, but that's kind of the thought, is how fast can they find a buyer? Are you going to help them find a buyer? Hey, I got this guy, I got this guy, I got this guy here, this person's buying. If you did have that, you probably wouldn't be even having the conversation, right? Because you wouldn't be calling me. But that's the thought. Now, if your developer is really unmotivated, it's not even listed, that's where we get into problems. Sometimes developers don't want to flood the market with their listings, and they have these other games that they're playing. and you might be stuck in the middle of that. I would still, of course, use that as dry powder. The developer had an obligation to mitigate, chose not to list my unit. Why is my client having now to pay greater amount of losses? The property market declined. It took them 6 months. If they'd sold in the first 3, it could have still been there. See the kind of, I'd use the shotgun kind of strategy, 1,000 little arguments. We have this, we haven't talked too much about disclosure statements, but very often that's an angle that is tried by people to try to argue there was this late disclosure. Maybe it wasn't late, but they've already signed a contract. It's been, months. And then a material fact comes up in a revised or a new disclosure from the developer. That we try to make into a big mountain as the right to rescind, to get out, and the deposit back. Rescinding generally allows you to get the deposit back. Very quickly, this is all about you purchasing a property. The developer gives you this real estate marketing development, REDMA, disclosures.
Yes.
What if something materially changes? They have to give you a disclosure. Material, it does not mean like, the fixtures. It means more to the heart of the matter at law. Very factual. I pulled up a list of case summaries here if we wanted to go really deep in it, but very effectively, it's really like, what exactly happened. For example, the closing date was moved 3 days. I don't know. Hey, you said strata was going to be 500. It's 501. I want out. There's this concept of law. It's a Latin word that's de minimis. Back when cannabis was illegal, if you're caught with an amount of cannabis that was too little to even consume, arguably that's like de minimis. It's too small to sanction you criminally. I'm not a criminal lawyer. Sorry, criminal lawyers. It's a terrible explanation. But that's the concept here, is like de minimis. That's not really major. Another way to think about this is, if you knew this before you signed the contract, not you specifically, but would a reasonable person not have signed the contract? And it's a little subjective, because if the strata goes, this is where the case law gets messy, and that means it's expensive to use lawyers to sort out. Back to the unfairness of the situation. Moving a year. Let's say they have an outside closing date and they say 2026, and say, hey, it's going to be 2028. That's probably gut feeling with other facts. You said 2026 as I signed in 2020. You said 2022 now. That's probably getting pretty close to rescission territory. You're not going to get me to say yes or no on this podcast because it's so factual.
No, of course.
Failure to deliver, the developer has the timelines to disclose. Failures on that side, you might be able to find an objection as to form. Hey, the developer didn't dot the I's, cross the T's. Rare, possible. The strata fee one is one that we're trying. We have an active file right now we're working on. That's what we're trying. The strata fees went up. I'm trying to do the math in my head. Over 65, 70% from what they were. The proposed strata fees.
That's a lot.
It's a big jump. Now, they weren't that big to begin with, but, when you phrase it like whatever, that kind of percentage, it sounds higher. And, of course, that's how we're phrasing it. The percentage sounds better or worse, I guess, depending on your context. We'll see. We're not going to court. We're just exchanging letters and trying to convince them that, well, there's this and there's that. And, they don't speak English well. They didn't get a lawyer. Please. What we're really trying to do is make it seem that we're prickly. We might not be easy to deal with, and that might hopefully encourage them to say, hey, you know what, they're being reasonable, they're being proactive, just move on. That's the strategy that resonates with these clients. Sometimes clients don't.
Yes.
The strategy of like the walking away strategy you said, that strategy often entails ghosting, hiding. And I wouldn't advise hiding, but if you can't get served, it's hard to sue you. And so that's kind of a cost. If you make yourself very well known and they have an ad on all these things for you, you're going to be darn easy to sue. If you're a non-resident and you're off the grid, so to speak, I'm not suggesting you evade service and try to defeat the court process here. Not at all what I meant. As a lawyer, I would never advise that. But there's a practical reality of service, right? The concept of serving somebody. Developers are going to sue you. They're going to have to find you and put documents in your hands and say, we're going to sue you. That's what kind of starts off the lawsuit. You can get around that at court, right? There's alternate substituted service and ways around that. So that's why I'm saying I would never advise somebody just hide. I would advise, address the issue as, confidentially, consult a lawyer, strategize and brainstorm. No one needs to know. Figure out your best case, your worst case, alternatives to court, right? Hey, if I get sued, what's going to happen? Okay, is there any alternative to that? What's my other worst case in it? And I think processing things that way You very quickly will find out how screwed you are. And I think that's a good position to be in, is acknowledge the power imbalance. If you want to walk away from this contract, it's not you. It's an uphill battle, and you're kind of pleading for mercy because of the market conditions. So there's all these, that's what kind of saying interest. There's all these parallel things. The market conditions will probably influence the behavior of the developer. We can point to contract clauses all we want, rescission is, but ultimately, does the developer have time and patience to sue you? Do you have the money to pay that lawsuit? And often this walk away from the deposit concept that I like to tease is the right solution. But it's more view it as a pool of money to be negotiated.
As the market is not in favor of product to be moved, supply demand is like in balance, and all these things that you have shared is more applicable on the worst case scenario outcomes for everybody. It's there's nothing more, market movement, macroeconomics is not supporting on assignments very easily, just because there's no buyers in the market to be able to make that option. But the subject of this being walking away, and there's a lot of great learnings from this based on scenarios you have shared. But I wanted to move on to, if you're able to put all this together, if you can share a good outcome and not so good outcome without obviously confidentiality sharing any clients for yourself. Do you have anything like you were involved in something like this? Obviously buyers walk away. What kind of like an outcome happened? If you can share any real case scenarios from yourself.
Yeah, I can say we've done thousands. Well over $1 billion plus of transactions of money through our trust account, because it's purchase money, they flow through our trust account. $1 million properties here, been doing this for many years now. It's very rarely, most of that has been upmarket, and so and times are changing in that regard. Not a single person that I'm aware of in our firm, we're getting bigger so it's hard to remember everybody, has failed or bailed on one of these contracts as a buyer and been sued by the developer, lost a deposit, and got sued. I've not yet personally seen that. There's a lot of court cases about that, so it does happen. It's just in the Tri-Cities, I've not seen it here. And we do work outside of the Tri-Cities. We've seen it all over BC. It's just Lower Mainland's where a lot of these pre-sale stuff, and Vancouver Island, bit in the interior. The most common outcome is negotiating for part of your deposit to come out. Most practically, you almost want to wait until it sells to see what to get a certainty on your loss. And this is a kind of getting very strategic again, but the client, the buyer, needs to make a strategic decision. If they feel we haven't come close to the bottom yet and it's going down, very subjective, probably relying on a bit of your expertise, let's crack a deal out. Because if you think it's going down, that means your damages, your potential loss is going up, and you have the means to pay it. So shoot, I'm going to be sued. Yeah. I would argue proactively, confidentially negotiating is probably my top advice to see before the sale price. Hopefully I can walk away from some or all of my deposit to get that release, a document from the developer saying you're excused from liability. That's going to be, in my mind, very important. So I would change the conversation. It's not about getting away from the contract. It's how much do I have to spend to buy a release from the developer. And I might have to give my whole deposit. I saw an article, little CBC thing today on some home buyers in Vancouver that were grateful they just lost their deposit. And they were like on the news saying, I can't believe we're saying that. I got a call, I'm so happy that we just lost our deposit. That is a good outcome in this market rate.
Yes.
Now, the other way is if it sells quick, or you can wait for the sale, you've crystallized your losses. And this is indirect interest carrying costs that we talked about too. That's probably not too much. It's not interest for the whole project. It's going to be your proportionate unit amount. Then you've crystallized your losses. You know the dollar value. You can cut a check or choose not to pay it and sue me. So that's the first fork, is where is the client's risk tolerance? Subjectively, very personally, my risk tolerance is that earlier disclosure and negotiation.
Yes.
I feel I'd rather have a little bit of control on the outcome. If we go the other route, one, I might have angered the developer. They're less reasonable now. I now might not look good to the courts. Oh, so you're the guy who signed the contract, didn't perform it, didn't talk to them. You knew you weren't going to close months before closing, didn't tell anybody, misrepresented the realtor. Often as a lawyer, sometimes clients misrepresent information to us to try to whitewash the reality. Everything's going to be fine. That's all privilege. It doesn't come in front of the court. But I hear it sometimes. Really? They'll exaggerate in their mind. They'll try to justify what they're doing is okay. But they'll justify it as in, well, there was a delay. So no, the contract contemplated the closing date would be this date or 3 years later, and we're within that span. You didn't know what you signed. That's not the developer's problem. And I find the sooner as a buyer you can just see it for what it is, the reality, not trying to shame or blame anybody, but just the sooner you can recognize reality, the sooner you can deal with it. And often that involves, unfortunately, you're entangled with a big developer with deep pockets. I should say shallowing pockets in this economy. And that is what I would spend time talking to my clients about, is who is this developer? How many units are available in the building? That political angle, I'd almost start to consider that way. And I really put weight on that in my kind of tailored strategy for the specific file. Who is on the other side here? And I would talk to the agent. Hey, do you know anybody who's flipping? Is there any movement in that building? I'd bring the realtors in on the strategy. You guys are going to be very helpful in deciding on what do we do? It's nobody's fault. Interest rates was a big challenge for a lot of people. Tail end now, but that was a lot of phone calls. Hey, interest rates went up. No deal, right? Force majeure. I'm out of the deal. You're like, probably not.
Justin, there was a lot of great options, from when, since the expert in the legality aspect, the number of things you raised for some buyers that are in the situation and will be is quite sort of hopeful, because there's some, they have a lot of worrisome, some have purchased for the first time, and even as a person on the sales side, this market is very new to many agents, because in times it used to be some sort of an exit, which assignments was supportive, but this is a bit different. So leading into the last item of our podcast, as somebody knows that they have to walk away, and they talk to their agent, they say, hey, product in 2022 was 1 million. Right now, even developer is selling their surplus at 800. And so they know all this. This is facts. What do you recommend when they should seek a legal expert to know that something like this will happen? They will have to walk away. What do you advise them, and how that they can prepare and to be in touch with a legal expert?
As soon as possible is one answer. You should, as soon as you don't think you can complete, as soon as you know you cannot complete, not think. As soon as this isn't going to happen, you should probably consider disclosing that. There's, not to go off on a tangent, I'll keep it short. The Supreme Court of Canada is kind of articulating this new implied contract term. Implied meaning it's not in the contract, but the law is going to say it applies to all contracts. It applies to all contracts, being the duty to perform your contractual obligations in good faith. That doesn't mean act against your own interests. It means don't be deceitful. That also doesn't mean volunteer information that hurts you. But that's kind of where this is coming from, is that are you doing this in good faith? I can't do, you should be working with the other side to manage the losses, because you disclosing that, the theory that I'm saying, might help the developer lose less money, which helps you. That's if they're reasonable. But now, to your point, the developer's offloading at a couple $100,000 losses. If you still have enough time, this is the other hand, well, maybe there's an argument that we should wait, not volunteer anything to the developer. Maybe this will pick back up. Maybe my financing will come through. Maybe I'll get that inheritance. Maybe there's some kind of intervening event that might save the day. Don't love that kind of wishful thinking, but I have been a part of many files where it's instead of coming clean saying, hey, this isn't going to happen, the answer is we need a 1 month extension. And we'll pay you $1,000 for it because we know some big thing's going to happen. That's kind of when sometimes I wouldn't say volunteering. But if you know this is not going to happen, rarely is waiting going to make you lose less money. Often it's probably not. It's probably not going. Again, other than the market picks back up again, it's oh shoot, you'd feel pretty silly for agreeing to a $200,000 loss when by the time closing comes around, it was only a $100,000 loss. So there's a bit of a gamble there.
One thing that anytime we hear as real estate agents, a client says, well, I'll just walk away. Our advice has always been to seek independent legal advice. And now I'm going to just be more in terms of your firm. Most people dealing with lawyers makes them nervous, makes them very uneasy about the costs associated or so on. If a person was to start to do a consultation with your firm, just as to discuss this, how do you take on the process?
Great question. Well, we have to do a conflict check. Make sure we don't work for the developer, obviously. And if that passes, there's really two thoughts that I have. Earlier, paying all that money, got to review the contract. That's all true, and that's kind of just the cost of doing business. Maybe I've already reviewed the contract. That's the other idea. Ask the lawyer, hey, here's a contract for development project X. Sometimes there's lawyers that, I've done 10 of those. I know that contract well. You hire that lawyer. So ask them. And I know a lot of lawyers in the community. I've read a lot of the projects around here, so I know some of them. Other lawyers in my office, others. So we have some expertise we can pull on, which is the best thing. The price might be able to be flat rated. If you send me the contract, I'll often no charge. And most lawyers will do this. Take a quick look at the contract, estimate how much time it's going to cost them, estimate some questions, and then flat rate it. My hourly rate is $500 an hour. That's probably medium plus, in the Tri-Cities for my year of call and expertise. You can get cheaper and you probably do an adequate, great job. This is not super complex. Now, when I say there's two forks here, hey, lawyer, what are my obligations? What does this mean? That's very kind of okay, the deliverable is to explain, or is the deliverable to strategize? And I think that's really what people come in saying, what do I do? That's what they're not asking, well, section such and such of REDMA prescribes it. They don't care, and I think a lot of lawyers make the mistake lecturing and memos. Realistically, it's what do I do? That's what I want to know, and that conversation, I still got to read the contract, but almost a quick 5-10 minute phone call with the person first, Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's often free just to, hey, what's going on here? Often at 5-15 minutes, I can say, listen, you probably should hire a lawyer, not legal advice. You're screwed. This isn't going to end well for you. You got a couple options here. It's going to cost you a couple $1,000s for us to send a letter out and see what happens. That client doesn't call back, but I almost gave them what they wanted, which is okay, good. But I would say $500 to $2,000, regardless of which firm or notary you go to get somebody to look at your contract and say, here's what I think you should do. And that's the key. Don't ask the lawyer first. I'm looking for strategic advice, not legal information. That's the real estate agents. Everybody can tell you what's in these things, but what should I do, I think, is what you should be paying a lawyer for. Plus, we're liable. If we tell you to do, this is what you should do, and you do it, and it blows up in your face, I have some explaining to do. And that's the value in seeing a lawyer and that's why lawyers give very risk-adverse conservative advice, because I know if you rely on what I'm saying and I'm wrong, now I'm in trouble. And that's what you should be looking for. You want to find that fiduciary, hey, lawyer, put your neck on the line and say what I should do. And often it's going to be, you should email them, and it's not going to be,
of course,
assign it to a shell company and hide and avoid service. That's not going to be my advice.
And ultimately, a buyer, if I'm putting myself into a buyer's shoe, if it's financially already that I'm knowing that I have, it's an investment, and I educate everybody taking a step into pre-sales. Historically, we went to historic stats, but there are downside risks, and based on what you just shared and all the details, you also bring in peace of mind at the end, because somebody wants to walk out of this disagreement so they can move on, and developer and the buyer potentially can just take their own their path for a solution. Say I'm not a real estate agent and I'm just a person looking to go into pre-sale for the first time. Summarizing all the great advice that you have shared in this podcast, what would be your advice for me?
Jokingly, don't do it. That would be,
Fair.
practically speaking. You said something that I actually liked, and I might actually take myself. I got to workshop this a bit, but something about pre-sales and investments. I think that's the better way to think about pre-sales. Is it's still a home eventually. It's in between an investment and a home. Homes are it's a hard to explain, but like you're giving a builder confidence to complete their business venture. You're not a shareholder. You're not an investor in the company. In a sense, you're an investor in the project. And that is just, it's a slightly different care, and you're not buying a house or a condo.
Yes.
You're participating in this large venture, and what do you get out of it? The ability to buy this future thing in this price range that looks roughly like this, and that's what I would say to people. It's presented like, oh, you're just buying a condo that's yet to be built, but there's a lot of variables in that. And as I said, I say don't do it, but I've done it myself, and I have many friends and family that I have had do it with some successes and some failures. The key is you need to be prepared for that, and often on the front end, we got a lot of back end calls. Hey, I want to get out. Just I'm about to sign this contract. I'll say the same thing. 100% of people still sign it. I don't think I've ever talked to anybody. I've talked to people out of franchises before, but never out of a pre-build. You know, often by the time they come, their heart's set. It matches the price. It's the community. They like the light. All the things that I'm saying are so remote, and what's more important is they can close their eyes and imagine their family there at some point. So realistically, get the legal advice up front,
yes.
But you're not going to change your mind. And on the back end, telling somebody you're screwed, surprisingly, not always, and I wouldn't say it so rudely, of course, but surprisingly gives people comfort to be able to know, having a lawyer say, yeah, listen, here's the goalposts. It's probably not going to end well. Here's some exit ramp options for you. Even if they don't hire you, I talk to people years later, and they call you literally years later remembering that phone call because it just gave them the comfort to know, am I screwed? Is almost worse than knowing. And giving people the certainty, no, this is the reality you got to deal with. Enjoy. I think is actually a great position to be in, rather than what happens, can I walk away, can I not walk away? So I'd be in favor of doing it. Honestly, this podcast provided most of the paid information I would give out on a consult, just not targeted to specific. But this is roughly the things that we would talk about, and their risk tolerances. Can you, often it does come to bank of mom and dad comes up. Can you close anyways and just take a losses for a couple months? And we'll go through some of those options. Often if we're having the phone call, there are no other options by the time they come. Obviously more money solves this problem, but that's kind of, I feel like an idiot sometimes saying that to somebody. Well, can you just come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars? That would solve the problem. Get a second mortgage. Those are silly solutions because they're not based in reality.
The knowledge you shared is very valuable, and I thank you, because a lot of individual that's going to watch this content, and not just what's happening in this market, but even in future precaution. Because a lot of people are going to learn some lessons they never experience it, and be engaged with clients, engaging with developers, engaging with the sales arm. It's a very sort of like those uncertain moments everybody is going, and there will be some expensive lessons, but hopefully most people will keep that in mind, and your time and advice here is really appreciated.
My pleasure. Take care.